individuals who have opened themselves up to receiving God's mercy, who have thoroughly reflected and searched the interior of their soul through those experiences. I consider myself a Christian. I find a greater resonance of truth value with Ibn Arabi than I do with, and the more we open ourselves up to other people who are genuinely, seeking God, who are genuinely following the desire of the ruh to its source, then we become enriched by those journeys. We have to turn to God in prayer, and in that prayer, trust God's response to us and listen and discern what that response is. And because God is the one who guides us on the right path, I would rather trust in that than trust in my own ability to think through which way to go. What we could say was noble about Eliade is that he tried to get people to respect and appreciate what's true in other religions other than Christianity. God says, I will show you my signs on the horizon and in your soul. They can truly see and comprehend how creatures are ayat of God. Phrases and these statements of Hallaj and Bastami and others were said in a state of wajd, in this state of fana. Does he mean that there is absolutely no connection between our idea of God and what God is in reality? I don't think Mullah Sadra would say, here, read the transcendental wisdom just for the sake of reading the wisdom, but read it so that you grow as a spiritual person, so that you become closer to God, so that you become aware of God's presence. Is that same source. You're drinking from the same fountain, but it's quenching your thirst in different ways because of how open you are to what that fountain is providing.
Welcome again in our second part of this very detailed, complicated interview about religious pluralism with Dr. James Nally from the States. So welcome again.
Thank you.
So we'll dig more deeply in the issue of religious pluralism, and obviously all people who study comparative religion studies, they think about other people and the afterlife of other people. It's a very modern, important topic nowadays. So it is only a pluralism in salvation where God may treat people with His grace and mercy. And this is not our job. It's the job of God how to treat people. But then we pose another question, which is, do we believe in a certain level of truth pluralism where levels of truth and wisdom can be found in other religions also? Because as we mentioned earlier, as a Muslim, I believe, okay, all the revelations from God, all the prophets are from God, and there is a transcendent unity of religion in a certain theory. But then I believe that Islam and Quran is the perfect, it's the most beautiful image, it's a complete image. Okay, you may have high levels of wisdom, but then I'm not me, because maybe I'll not be a perfect representation of following and embodying Islam. But the doctrine of Islam is more pure and more beautiful than others. So how you perceive other religions as religions of wisdom and truth?
Well, I think it's important, again, like we emphasized earlier, that there can't be an absolute pluralism of truth. So we can't say, like, for example, there are many gods. If God is truth and God is one, then there ultimately, at its absolute foundation, there is only one truth. There is only al-haq.
Absolutely.
Now, the question we need to turn to is, what is truth in relation to the human mind, or what we could say, what are truths, plural, in relation to the truth? And I'm a firm believer that truths we could say truth with a lowercase, is it is a proportioning of the mind to the object known. So whenever we know something, I can know this cup, I can know you, I can know my dog. There is a certain sense in which the object that is exterior to myself becomes proportioned to my rational faculty, and to the degree that it is proportioned to my rational faculty, that idea then becomes either a true idea or a false idea. The more proportioned the idea is to the object, the greater the truth value of that idea. So if we have that on the one hand, and now we turn to our doctrines and dogmas and teachings and ways of speaking, we've already established that these things, these doctrines, dogmas, traditions, in some sense, and in a very real sense, they are the articulated reflection upon God's revelation, either in a very public revelation, such as the Quran or the Injil or the Torah, or they can be reflections upon the more private experiences we have of God in prayer. So in a way, I don't like talking about the truth value of Christianity in part, or as separated from the person who is articulating it. So the more the articulation is conformed to the idea that they're trying to convey, and then the more that idea is conformed to the object that is trying to be known, in this case God, then their articulation becomes more true or less true. So in that sense, I don't want to be the one to say with certainty whether or not the kind of larger system of articulation within Islam or the larger system of articulation within Christianity is more or less true. But I would like to say that individuals who have opened themselves up to receiving God's mercy, who have thoroughly reflected and searched the interior of their soul through those experiences, those particular people will have a higher truth value to what they are saying than somebody who's not. And it's for this reason that when I read Ibn Arabi, for example, I find it resonates in such a deep way with my soul that I can unequivocally say there is a high truth value in what he is saying. And I could look at some, say, Christian author, we could say Calvin, for example, the kind of father of Calvinism. I could read what he is writing, and it doesn't have that same level of resonance. Even though I consider myself a Christian, I find a greater resonance of truth value with Ibn Arabi than I do with Calvin. But then when I'm reading Aquinas, I can feel a greater truth value of resonance with Aquinas than I can for, say, Al-Kindi.
Or Eckhart, for example, as a Christian mystic, for example.
Say the question.
I mean, Meister Eckhart as a Christian mystic also will be similar maybe to Ibn Arabi.
Yeah, I think there are some ways in which reading Ibn Arabi next to Meister Eckhart can lead us to perhaps misunderstand Ibn Arabi. I have respect for Meister Eckhart, but I can't say I've read him enough to kind of make that judgment on. I mean, certainly I've I resonate with what he is saying, but I can't say I know him well enough to say I would recommend, you don't want to recommend somebody who might lead someone else astray in their spiritual journey. So I would say that I don't feel I understand Meister Eckhart enough to say I would recommend him to somebody else.
So you are insisting on the idea of this deep innate path, or this personal journey towards knowing God with every person, and then we have this famous wisdom or saying that says there are as many paths to God as there are human breaths. So I think we can understand this saying by these personal journeys, maybe.
Yeah, I think that's certainly the case. And again, our journeys are enriched. They are made deeper and more meaningful the more we are able to interact with one another. The less we close ourselves off in these boxes and echo chambers, the less we do that, and the more we open ourselves up to other people who are genuinely seeking God, who are genuinely following the desire of the Ruh to its source, then we become enriched by those journeys because we now acquire new ways of reflecting upon those experiences. We acquire new ways of articulating those experiences. And if we limit ourselves, if I never took my encounter with Protestants at a young age seriously, I never would have thought through my own spiritual journey so much. And then as that went on, if I had not stepped outside the kind of traditional borders of Christianity to truly engage my Muslim brothers and sisters, not just in an arbitrary, dismissive way, but to truly listen with both my head and my heart, then I would have been depriving myself of an opportunity to have a greater understanding and greater encounter with God.
There's always an issue of conversion, and then what if a person asks, what if God wanted me to follow a certain religion, a certain ritual, a certain type of prayer, a certain jurisprudence, and maybe we don't say that was the only path of salvation from that religion, but we say that was the most perfected path of salvation, which I lost. And then I think, what is the response from a religious person to such a question? It's the response that I tried my best, and the conclusion I reached to is that the religion that I'm with is the best, because most people, they're born and they're affected with their society and culture and language and their teachers with a certain religion, and then when they get elder, they try to strengthen their beliefs with all the experience that happens with them. Maybe some people will convert, but what our answer should be to this question? It should be that I tried my best and this is what I see is right?
Well, I think it's important to keep in mind, and you said this earlier, so I'm just going to repeat what you said. It's ultimately God who decides whether we get the reward or the punishment. In some sense, we have to have a trust. We have to have tawakkul in what we're doing, and that requires it's not a purely, again, discursively rational thing we have to do. If we try to decide on our own, relying completely on ourselves, what path to follow, if I try to just think of myself as I am this person, I'm going to consider each religion, on the foundations of reason alone. I'm not going to know what to do. Rather, what we have to do is we have to turn to God in prayer, and in that prayer, trust God's response to us and listen and discern what that response is. And I am a firm believer in the hope that God is really the one who guides us on the right path. And because God is the one who guides us on the right path, I would rather trust in that than trust in my own ability to think through which way to go.
You talked about prayer, and I think there's a beauty in the spiritual dimensions in the prayer of Christian people, just like Muslims. But when I encountered a friend who was praying in a church, I saw that like being down on the knees, and it has a certain spiritual beauty.
Yeah. What are you asking about Christian prayer in particular?
Yeah.
Well, I think we need to be aware that Christians, just like every other religious person, in a sense, we are human. So we can't always know the heart of someone's prayer. It's obviously, we know somebody could be down on their knees and they could be crying, or they could be reciting all the prayers they want, and it could look very, very devout from the outside. But again, because we don't know what's in their heart, ultimately what I try to do for my own spiritual well-being is I try to look at people's examples, not so much is their prayer effective or not, because that would require me knowing what's in their heart. But I look at, based on what I can see, is this person inspiring me to treat my spiritual life more seriously? Because obviously, while we don't know what's in somebody's heart, somebody who never prays, who never gives themselves up in devotion, that person is not likely to inspire us to bow before the creator of the universe. Now, somebody who is doing that, I mean, this is one of the things that I've always deeply admired about my Muslim brothers and sisters, is they really, more than anyone else, have shaped my prayer life in terms of the seriousness of devotion and the just utter importance of prayer. Now, my prayers and how I pray is reflected in accordance with the Catholic tradition, and so it takes on the form of the Catholic tradition. But in a very deep and real sense, the seriousness with which I take prayer is directly linked to my engagement and encounter and companionship with my Muslim brothers and sisters.
Great. There is, I'll quote from John Heck's book, which the title of it is God Has Many Names, where he talks when you visit places of worship, different places of worship, you discover with a shock and surprise the same kind of thing is taking place in them as in a Christian church. And then he goes and says outward signs are different between a mosque, church, temple. What they wear, how they sit, the musical instruments that they use, how they sing. But the supreme being that is referred to is Allah, God, or Krishna. It's only the different names, but yet the important sense in which that is being done in the several forms of worship is essentially the same. So I think this idea of respecting a different spiritual experience of different people, no matter the religion, what the religion was, is insisting on this idea. And then I don't know if you would like to comment on his.
Yeah, I think what's important, and this is where I kind of disagree with John Hick a little bit. I think what we witness that's the same is this natural desire of the soul for God. That's what we're witnessing. That's where we're able to come together, is we all have this desire, this thrust of the soul that can't be fulfilled with earthly things. In the same way, if I'm hungry and all somebody ever gives me is dust, my hunger will never be satisfied. But what satisfies is, that which our spirit longs for. So just as when we're hungry, we know there's something that we want that's going to fulfill that desire. So we have this kind of knowledge just within our very nature of what's gonna satisfy, and we all seek to fulfill this desire in our different traditions, our different rites and modes and ways of thinking and speaking about it. And so that's where we're united. But again, because all of our ways of thinking as individuals, not necessarily in terms of the larger tradition, but just as individuals, our conceptions and how we understand the tradition can have a greater or lesser conformity with the object in question, in this case, God. You and me could have very different ways of talking about something, but because of the conformity of what you're saying to the object you're trying to get to, God, and the conformity of what I'm saying in the object I'm trying to get to, God, are very closely related, then we have this kind of unity of the object. But somebody else, we could think of a Christian person who, they go to church once a year, they, spend their days indulging in earthly pleasures. They don't pray, they go out drinking every day. Such a person, even if we say the same thing verbatim, like we could say the same words, what those words kind of connects to within our minds and within our spirits aren't the same thing. So I know I just made it a lot more complicated,
Yeah.
but that's where I kind of disagree a little bit with Hick.
So
I think,
where is the negative side exactly of the doctrine of Hick here? That he generalized this to all different people, which is not true, because people are different in their commitment to their faith and to God.
Yeah, I think because what Hick wants to say is that if I'm understanding Hick correctly, and I fully admit I might be misunderstanding him, but on the chance I'm understanding him properly, what I understand Hick to be saying is that Islam, without reference to Muslims, that Christianity, without reference to Christians, that these systems are just trying to get to the same thing. And what I want to say is that it's more rooted in the actual individual rather than within the abstract system that he's referencing.
I think maybe the story of Moses and shepherd in Rumi's Mathnawi, I think you're familiar with this story.
Maybe remind me of it.
It is always mentioned when talking about religious experience or pluralism, when Moses saw a shepherd who's trying to describe God and saying God has hair, and where is him? I'm waiting for him to come so I can help him and I can wash his hands and legs and provide a place for him to sleep. And like this, so Moses comes with his anger and he's saying, you're describing God in a very bad way and you're completely wrong. And then God says to Moses, why did you said this thing to our worshipper, to our very nice, faithful person? He was feeling very deep spiritual feelings, but his language and his theological abilities are limited, and we accept people as they are. We see their hearts, we see their essence, and we don't mind if they mistake in some surfaced or language.
Yeah,
so
that's exactly what I'm getting at. That there's more to the either unity or disunity of believers than just what we say. That again, the unity comes within the heart and not just within our ability to say something.
I think also Ibn Arabi has this famous poetry when he says, my heart has become capable of accepting all forms, in the same context, that he's understanding different religious experiences that are happening with different people.
Yeah, I agree.
Now I'd like to ask another question regarding the doctrine of Mيرسيا إلياد, or I don't know how it's pronounced rightly, but we say in Arabic Mيرسيا إلياد. So he says, what unites religions from an ontological point of view, wherein all things that are sacred and so real are so because the sacred discloses itself as such in them, and the human spirit postures itself in relation to the locus of that disclosure as sacred. So how do you perceive Iliad's model on religious diversity or pluralism, where he tries to describe all religious icons, rituals as sacred through pure personal religious experiences which people encounter in different religious cultures?
Yeah, so it's important to keep in mind for Eliada's teaching, especially in his book, Sacred and the Profane, is he starts off with this dichotomy, specifically that the sacred and the profane. And what he sees as the kind of religious hypothesis, we could say, is that the sacred posits the profane as its locus of revelation, that because we have this distinction between the two, the profane then becomes a pointer or a source wherein we can see the sacred. But as he goes on, you kind of see in his writing that as the sacred gets bigger and bigger and bigger, the profane becomes less and less and less, until you reach the point at the end of his book where there is no more profane. There's only the sacred.
So you mean that there is no any manifestations, there's only God, he means?
That's seems to be the conclusion, or that seems to be the logical conclusion of what he's trying to suggest, in such a way that the profane no longer has any kind of reality to itself, that the profane gets swallowed up by the sacred. And so then the question becomes, is the sacred revealing itself through the profane, or is the sacred revealing itself as the profane? And I think these are two they're similar but very different ideas. If the sacred is revealing itself through the profane, then we can say, along with the Quran, that God says, I will show you my signs on the horizon and in your soul. In this sense, the profane, everything other than God, reveals God insofar as it points towards God. And so we don't confuse the sign, we don't confuse the horizon, we don't confuse our soul for being God, but we see that God reveals God's self through these things.
So we can see God names and qualities all manifested around us.
Right. But if we say that the sacred reveals itself as the profane, which is what I think Mīrcea Eliade eventually does with his book, then the horizons and our soul, they're no longer pointing towards God, but they become God. And that is something that I don't think either Muslims or Christians would want to say. We don't want to say that the world is God, but we do want to say that God reveals God's self through these items. In the same way, my speech reveals something about what I'm thinking, but because there's this disconnect between the conformity of my speech with the inter dimensions of my heart, that my speech reveals something about what's in my heart, but my speech is not the same thing as what's in my heart. So I think what we could say was noble about Eliade is that he tried to get people to respect and appreciate what's true in other religions other than Christianity. So I think that was very noble, and we can certainly applaud him for doing that. But I
and
think
also people praise him because he came with a theory that a human being is faithful or religious or a believer in his essence. So there is no chance for any human being for not being religious, because whatever he chooses, there is a deep innate feeling or push towards the sacred.
The homo religio, as he called it. Yeah, I think he was certainly the first person in the modern period to make this claim. But I think the idea of, that the human person is innately religious, that's something that certainly Jews, Muslims, and Christians have been saying for thousands of years. I don't think he's new in saying that. I just think he's as a
especially with the doctrine of fitra, what we say fitra, the instinct.
Precisely.
But he discovered this idea outside the religious texts and doctrines.
We could say he discovered the ideas outside, but at the same time, if we look at his own personal life, he grew up in a very devoutly religious Eastern European family. So I wouldn't want to say he discovered.
After studying all religions, he discovered that the common between all religious activities and traditions is that faith is something that is.
Yeah. Okay. We can certainly say that. But yeah, I think again, I just think where he went astray in some sense was where he ultimately forgot in his overwhelming appreciation for the sacred. We could say his overwhelming appreciation for God, he forgot what it means to be a creature. And we see this with mystics sometimes. They get so caught up in their mystical experience that they say something they wouldn't normally say. And I think that's where we have to be careful of reading Eliade. We have to know when he says too much.
So this is what we say also as shatahat with Al-Hallaj or Al-Bastami, I am the truth or something. But this also can be understood in its own context. And it can be praised because they reach to a very high spiritual level where they're not seeing only God. So they are saying that there is no anything but God. So you mean from this point of view, or you mean that he's presenting a very false idea?
I think, well, the only difference between, I would say, the statements of Al-Hallaj or Al-Bastami and the writing of Mيرسيا Eliade is the phrases and these statements of Hallaj and Bastami and others were said in a state of wajd, in this state of fana. Whereas Eliade, his book appears at least to be written in a state of complete control over his faculties and his senses. So he doesn't seem to be in that state of mystical ecstasy while writing his book. And because he isn't in a state of if he is not in a state of mystical ecstasy when he makes this argument, then we have to be more suspicious of it than, say, somebody who is caught up in that mystical experience.
Great. I'd like to talk more even about John Heck's theory, because he develops his theory about religious pluralism through the Kantian divide between the real in itself and the real as experienced by us. So he states that our minds or our souls have no access to the real in itself, but we can understand with our limited concepts and abilities. So do you have a comment on this idea? Because we always, as we said, whatever we think is created with our limited brains, but then he's stating that we can't have any connection with the real in itself. So how do you comment?
Right. So it's, in a sense, there's a question that has to be asked. Whenever we say that, whenever he says that we can't have an experience of the real in itself, we only have access to kind of our conceptualization of it. That is, we have access to a type of phenomenality rather than the numinous. And this goes back to Kant's transcendentalism. Does he mean, the question we have to ask ourselves is, does he mean that there is absolutely no connection between our idea of God and what God is in reality? Or is there a very minimal connection between our idea of God and what God is in reality? And I think he actually has two answers for this. The text you're quoting from has two different publications, one with an updated introduction. And in the first publication, I think what he means is that we cannot conceive of what God is in reality. In other words, our mind and our ideas do not correspond perfectly with God, because God transcends everything we can think of. But even though God transcends everything of our ideas, that our ideas still point to and are connected to God. So in other words, we could say, God is completely unlike our ideas, but our ideas are like God. So there's this uneven kind of relationship that as we get closer and closer, our ideas get closer and closer to God, God transcends more and more and more and more, so that our ideas are kind of constantly chasing after God.
But there should be a kind of a link or a connection to God. Otherwise, we can't worship him because we won't be able to know him.
Exactly. And I think in his second introduction, his revised introduction, he goes the opposite direction. I think in his revised introduction, he says that our ideas have no actual connection to God. And following Kant, God becomes this kind of limit concept. So that God, the only thing we can think of God is just the furthest limit of our idea, of our ability to think. And so really what that describes is not, it doesn't describe God, it just describes our limited mental capacity, which I think is I think that's problematic. So as you were saying, if there is no connection, even if it's just the most minimal connection, then our worship would only be directed to something in our mind.
What we created in our brains.
Right. But not only that, it also then, it begs the question, well, what about revelation? If our concepts of God have no connection to what God is, and our concepts are derived from revelation, then are these revelations even from God? I mean, if God is so transcendent that he can't even reveal himself, then what is all this? And I think that's another problem for at least the traditionally religious person.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And this is a critique that we can mention about Hex doctrine.
Correct.
Another issue also you mentioned in one of your articles is that about the original moments. And you say here, like, for example, Islam, economy, history, religion, and so on, do not exist as things or entities with meaning inherent in them, but rather as articulations of structural relation. For example, Chinese Buddhism is a mixture of Chinese culture and Indian Buddhism. Yeah.
In that quote, I'm actually quoting somebody else who I disagree with.
Okay.
So the person who made this argument, they wanted to say that there is no such thing as Islam.
But there are Muslims only.
Right. So in that sense, this author would say there are only Muslims, and then there are regionally and temporally related ideas of Islam. So you and your family, let's say, you believe the same way, you kind of articulate the same thing, you belong to the same madhab, and school of jurisprudence and everything else. According to this author, who I'm disagreeing with, he would say, well, that's one Islam. And then your family next door, well, that's another Islam. And then, the family in India, well, that's another.
But that's not kind of similar of what you stated before previously about the issue of personal religious experiences that everybody encounters in his journey towards knowing God, and that there is no one similar to the other. There are as paths towards God as human breaths, or this is something that's totally different.
It's different, because what I'm articulating is that while there are differences, such as, if I'm in a church and the person next to me is in, we're saying the same things, but what's in our heart is different. There is a disconnect there. But is there an absolute disconnect? And according to this author, he wants to say that there is an absolute disconnect between these different groups of people, these different individuals who are articulating something. What I want to say is that these individuals, even though what's in their heart is different and how they are articulating things are different, that their reference point, that the source that they keep coming to is one and the same. And that's what I refer to as the original moment. This moment where God revealed himself to Muhammad that started the whole snowball effect, that everything kind of flows out from there. Because even if what's in your heart and what's in your neighbor's heart or what's in somebody else's heart is different, you have different ways of appropriating the text into your life. The text has different and deeper or shallower meanings to you depending on where you are in your spiritual life. Nonetheless, even with all of those differences, you are all returning to that same source, that same wellspring from which these experiences and this way of thinking and this way of helping direct your soul to its most deepest desire is that same source. You're drinking from the same fountain, but it's quenching your thirst in different ways because of how open you are to what that fountain is providing.
And that's why Sufi scholars and mystics say when you read the sacred verses from the Quran or other sacred verses, you should feel that they are being revealed to you, they are manifested to you at the moment, so that you can reach to a moment where you feel the essence of this Quranic ayah, that it's revealing to you, depending on your spiritual level, obviously.
Precisely. That's why I'm disagreeing with the author that you quoted from, because for him, all of these things are just social constructions that are a result of modernism. For him, you can't go and point at something that's Islam. You can only point at Muslims, and then from there you abstract and you get this idea of what Islam is. And he wants to say, well, that idea is not real.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And I want to say, insofar as each of these individuals are connected to that original moment, to that wellspring of the Quran, then in that they are connected, and it's in that wellspring, within the wellspring and the people's turning towards it, with that way that their heart is being drawn into it, that it's there that we find what Islam is. And it's not the type of discursive systematization that we think of, but it's that submission that is involved in going to the wellspring and finding sustenance in that wellspring.
So I understand. So he is trying to deny this reality by saying what we have as Islam or Christianity is a mixture of the culture, society, language, all these factors that are affecting our understanding. Thus, we don't have a real Islam or a real religion.
Yeah.
Okay, so let us conclude here. Let us just state some of the main advantages of such comparative studies. I think such studies will enable a person to understand his own religion in a deeper understanding. more than understanding other traditions. And then also you talk here about the instinct of faith. And I quote, this is a quote that you mentioned: virtue infused into a believer, which enables the mind to penetrate into the heart of the things and contemplate their innermost relation to the absolute. There is in man a sympathy for everything that has value and importance for him. I think you talked about that, but if you'd like to mention some final points about the importance of such studies.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll say just a little bit about the instinct of faith, or the instinctus fidei. This, I would say, it's a phrase developed from within Aquinas studies that I think corresponds with the Islamic idea of fitra. That is, there is something innate to the human. Like, if we think of the Greeks, they defined the human person as a rational animal, that it was reason that separated humans from everything else. But what we know through the concept of fitra, or this idea of the instinctus fidei, is that what actually truly separates us from, other creatures is this affinity of the soul for God, and that it's this affinity, this drive, because it is common to all of us, it also becomes the source where we can learn from one another. And so, because we are all aiming towards this ultimate goal, because we are all trying our best to get to our sustenance, that we are able to then sympathize with one another. When I encounter somebody else who has a deep longing for God, and who has given him or herself wholly up to that longing in a kind of humble patience for God's mercy and God's gift and God's presence, I can empathize and sympathize with that way of life because of this connection we have in virtue of who we are as people, whether we say it's fitra or we say it's this instinct of faith, the instinctus fidei, that it allows us to learn from one another, to develop and cultivate our spiritual lives in relation to one another, even if we speak differently, even if we think differently, that all of these refer back to ultimately our very ontological need and desire for God.
You reminded me with the ayahs وَفِي اخْتِلَافِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ وَأَلْوَانِكُمْ ayah, and then the other verse which says وَخَلَقْنَاكُمْ شُعُوبًا وَقَبَائِلَ لِتَعَارَفُوا, so to get to know each other in all different kinds of forms, to know other people's religions, cultures, societies, souls, and like this. And you also are mentioning the issue of wilaya, because a person is trying to become waliyullah. And I think it's an issue that you're working on now in your PhD, the wilaya image between Christianity and Islam. It fascinates me that you can find very similar images in both traditions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still in the preliminary stages of that research, so I don't want to say too much for fear of overstepping. But what I've noticed over the course of my study is when Ibn Arabi specifically talks about walaya and wali, what is he referring to? Because he, as we know, he's not a systematic thinker. He is all over the place. But we see these themes and concepts emerge where the wali, for example, in the Fas of Sheath, that the highest level of wali is somebody who has knowledge of God that corresponds, I don't want to say it's the same as, but corresponds with how God knows God's self. And in this knowledge, which is a gift from God, the person has insight not just into their own relationship with God and how they are connected to God, but they have a wisdom that allows them to see how other things are connected to God. So that way they can have true vision of hua la hua, how the cosmos is and is not God, so that they can truly see and comprehend how creatures are ayat of God. They can truly see how what's in their soul and what's on the horizon points to God, and what is that connection. And when Aquinas talks about the friends of God, he talks about this gift of wisdom that allows the friend to judge things according to as they are in the divine mind. So Aquinas has this idea, has this concept, this teaching of the divine ideas, where all of creation pre-exists within God's mind, and that then when creation kind of flows out of God, it flows out in accordance with the divine mind, the pattern of the divine mind, such that finite created reality is a refracted and fragmented kind of reflection of the divine mind, literally the divine mind, the logos, the word. And the friend of God, by the gift of the Holy Spirit, their mind is then conformed to the divine mind, such that they're no longer acting according to their own kind of principles as a human, that their thinking and judging and agency doesn't proceed according to finite reality, but it proceeds in accordance with the divine reality to which it has been conformed. And so just looking at this dynamic of what happens when we truly submit ourselves to God and kind of attain to this position of friendship, or where we are blessed so as to become friends through the divine mercy and divine gifts. How Ibn Arabi and Aquinas talk about this has such a deep resonance that it ultimately became the project of my dissertation, and I'm in the process of exploring all the complexities, not just what's similar, but how they differ. So yeah, that's a little taste.
Wishing you all the best in completing it in the best way possible. So to conclude, my final question will be, away from these deep questions that we talked about, comparative religion studies and pluralism, how do you describe the current situation regarding all these studies about mystical and Sufi studies in the Western academia or in the States, for example? Because I feel that it's growing rapidly, and many individuals from different religions, they are all interested in Sufism, Ibn Arabi, Rumi, Mullah Sadra, and these very deep stuff, even if they were not Muslim. So you feel the same thing, that this field is growing rapidly and there's importance given to this field?
Yeah, I do think it's growing very rapidly. I must say I am slightly concerned of people approaching this material, these authors, these masters, we could say, in a sense that, though they might not realize it, is, for lack of a better word, disrespectful to what the text is and who the author is in relation to the tradition from which they come. I've seen it enough just in my own study of the history of Christianity, how people would approach Aquinas in a way that says, well, okay, he's just a philosopher. I'm going to just pick apart his ideas for what he uses from the foundation of reason, and that's all I'm going to do with Aquinas. And the result of treating Aquinas that way has led to a great misunderstanding and distortion, I think, of who Aquinas was and what he's attempting to do with...
Yeah, because also Aquinas in the Arabic studies is only presented in a very logical way, like Ibn Sina, for example, or...
Yeah, and in doing so, we not only do we like misrepresent who the person is and what the text is, but we're missing. It's like, you know, you're handed a book, and they say, okay, well, you're only allowed to read it in this way and only read these sections. It's the same as being given a key to a treasure chest and say you're only allowed to admire the key. You know, I don't want to admire the key. I want to use the key to open the treasure chest. So I think, while I like the fact that studies in Ibn Arabi are growing, studies in Mullah Sadra are growing, I fear that the rapidity at which it's happening is going to distort what they were trying to do with their teaching. You know, I firmly believe Ibn Arabi or Mullah Sadra or Kunawi or Kashani or Bastami, you know, any of these individuals, they would rather their texts and their writings and their teaching, they would rather that transform people to turn them towards God rather than just to be studied on their own. I don't think Mullah Sadra would say, here, read the Transcendental Wisdom just for the sake of reading the wisdom, but read it so that you grow as a spiritual person, so that you become closer to God, so that you become aware of God's presence.
So the issue of academia is always trying to study things from outsiders or an outside point of view. So this is not an issue of studying Mullah Sadr or these the wisdoms by this kind of way, by only being an outsider and taking apart. It's an issue of being involved and living such values.
Yeah, we have to, I think, as scholars of religion, I think we have to be vulnerable to what the text is saying. If we do not allow ourselves to become vulnerable to what the text is saying and what the author is trying to do, then we will only misunderstand and misrepresent the text.
But then in the Western academia, is there a space for being an insider and a believer in writing and presenting ideas, or then in the writings we should be very professional and academic, and then in our personal experience we can choose our own path?
I think we can be both. I mean, as we said before, you know, if there's only one God, there is only one truth. And so if we're going to study these texts and present these texts, we can present them for what they are, but in order to present them for what they are, we have to be vulnerable to them. We do a disservice. We actually cover up the truth if we say, well, I'm detached and I'm going to talk about it now. I can talk about, you know, the historical construction of Aquinas' ideas. I can talk about the logical structure of his arguments. I can talk about the interconnectedness between God and virtue and, you know, human striving. But if I talk about that purely from a disconnected, dispassionate position, then I give the appearance that this text is a relic of a bygone era, that it's not a living text that has the power to change who we are. And I think that's just false. I think the same goes for Ibn Arabi. I think the same goes for Mullah Sadra or any of the great theologians and spiritual masters from any of these traditions, that if we are truly honest with the text, then we have to be vulnerable to the text. In the same way, if I'm truly honest in my engagement with you, then I have to be truly vulnerable to what you have to say. And if I'm not, then I'm not being honest.
Great, Dr. James Nally, and thank you very much for being with us and sharing all this beneficial knowledge and your experience in the academic area. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Have a good one.